Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 16, so let's get into it. It was like a really terrible party, where on top of everything else at the end, it turns out your ride bailed, and you have to walk home. It was cold, and Plum kept worrying that the bird would come back at any moment with reinforcements to claim its stolen goods, or the surviving half of the couple, if he had survived. She worried to the point where she kept losing her shit every time anything cawed or hooted, or one of them stepped on a stick. It had to be after them. No way would it let this go, not after the lengths it had already gone to. The only question was when. After Betsy left, or Amadeus, or whatever her name was. Stoppard had departed the scene, too, at top speed, on the busted club chair, with promises to reconnect back in New York once the coast was clear. Plum and Quentin were going to take the pool table, but when they tried to shift it, they discovered that they lacked the necessary motive power. All their magical strength was spent, so they set off on foot instead. Maybe they should have taken Lionel's gun for added protection, but they didn't. They just didn't want it. It was a long night and a long walk, but then again, everybody had a lot of explaining to do and a lot of thinking to do, too. Quentin told her what he knew about why Asmodeus, that was it, would have wanted the knife, and after hearing the tale of Renard, the murdering rapist fox god, she thought it was pretty understandable. She must have been planning to steal it all along. That was the whole reason she was there. All else being equal, Plum wished her well. But how had she known it was in the case in the first place? Plum didn't even have a guess. Quentin didn't either. Or, if he did, he didn't make it. More disquieting was the fact that Asmodeus obviously knew about Plum's family. She'd realized a while ago that the bird must know. Now it was clear that her secret identity wasn't anywhere near as secret as she thought it was, and that, being a Chatwin, meant that she was already a part of a lot of other people's stories in ways that she was only now becoming aware of. She figured she might as well tell Quentin at this point. She felt safe with him. She'd almost told him once at the hotel bar, and anyway, he asked why she could open the suitcase when nobody else could. Because, of course, he wasn't going to let that go. And that had to be the answer. Her great-grandfather had locked it and made sure only a family member could unlock it. She could have made up something, but she was so tired she couldn't think of a lie. And anyway, what was the point? For the record, Plum thought it was pretty rich that Quentin turned out to be connected to a hard case like Betsy, if only indirectly. But he was turning out to be a pretty hard case himself, in his way, or at any rate harder than she'd thought based on first impressions. And everywhere she looked, things were getting connected up, or rather it was becoming clear that they were already connected in ways that she was only just now picking up on. It was a worrying trend. Everybody else was deep into their own stories, and all the stories were woven together just beneath the surface into a web that included Plum. But what was Plum's story? Toward dawn, they'd recovered enough strength from the spellcasting orgy of the day before that they could risk some low flight just above the trees. They had no idea where they even were. Once the sun was up, they found a road and walked along it looking sufficiently pathetic and unthreateningly that some guy out for an early morning drive in his Honda Element gave them a ride into the nearest town. The town was called Armenia, as it happened, like Armenia, but without the R. It was in Dutchess County, New York, and it turned out to be the very last stop on the commuter train line to Manhattan, 2.5 hours away. So they steal-a-man-seed some dollars out of an ATM and bought tickets, plus some bad coffee and rubber croissants at the snack bar in the lobby of the train station. Then they sat on the old red bench in said lobby. It was 9 in the morning, and the next train wasn't till noon. It had been a long night, and a long day before that, and Plum needed to go to sleep and perchance to dream. Maybe dreaming she could begin to process and understand the sight of a room full of robed figures with golden hands, and Betsy standing over an electrocuted corpse, and Lionel opening fire on Stoppard, and Osmodius, nay, Betsy carving a suddenly non-human Lionel to pieces with a knife. Thinking about it again, she started to shake. Things had gone much too far, and her brain felt raw and scarred from it all. It wasn't how she'd imagined spending what should have been her last semester at Brakebills. It wasn't even how she'd imagined spending her post-Brakebills life of crime. As soon as she read the letter she found on her bed the night of the ghost, she knew she was going to take the job. Keep moving, keep busy. That was the rule number 1 of being Plum. And yeah, part of her got an illicit thrill out of it. She'd never had a rebellious phase, and she wasn't sure she wanted one, but she'd sure as hell gotten one. It was crazy and weird and kind of sleazy, but she embraced it. At least she'd learned some new magic from Quentin and Pushkar. Maybe she could spin it to her parents as an internship. What she really wanted was something she could fall in love with, the way she loved Brakebills, but at this point she wasn't sure she would ever find it. Even after her dramatic reveal, she and Quentin had eventually run out of conversation, and now they just sat there on the bench in the empty waiting room of the Amenia train station, looking out at the cement platform and the empty tracks under the empty white sky, feeling the weight of the sleepless night pressing down on their shoulders like a mile of ocean, and them sunk to the bottom of it. Plum let her mind spin off its axis. Her brain wasn't up to thinking about the future right now or about the past. It wasn't functioning on that level. So she hung out in the present, second by second. It was a surprisingly substantial train station for a town this tiny, this far from New York City. A flat-screen TV wedged into one corner of the lobby showed local news, including shaky iPhone footage of strange objects seen streaking across the sky last night. Plum wondered if people actually commuted to Manhattan from here. She wondered what it would be like just to be a regular civilian person who lived in Amenia, New York. She thought it might be pretty nice. Quentin kept taking out his pocket watch and looking at it. Plum wanted to find it annoying. It was kind of a hipster affectation, that watch, like a novelty beard. Especially since it didn't appear to work in spite of Stoppard's attentions. But it was such a strange and beautiful object. It drew her gaze magnetically. It must have been a gift, she supposed, from someone who loved him. That Julia person, maybe. More stories. "Do you want to read the book?" he asked. Oh, that. The leather-bound book that had been in the case. They'd taken it with them, of course, humped it through the woods, but now the thought of opening it filled her with dread. "Maybe we should burn it," she said. "Sooner or later the bird's going to come after it, so maybe when it does we're going to want to not have it. The bird will have to hire some new muscle first, round up more stooges like us. That'll take time. In the meantime, maybe it would help if we knew why the bird thought it was so important. I guess. We could always burn it later. Now you're talking. Let me see it." It was an old leather notebook, or maybe ledger was a better word for it. The kind of thing an accountant with a green eye shade might have written in an old-timey bank. The cover had the same monogram as the suitcase, RCJ. The spine was oddly modeled, blue and green. This was my great-grandfather's. I figured. What do you think's in it? Diary? Quentin said. What if it has dirty parts in it, like intimate confessions, that sort of thing? One way to find out. She nodded, resigned. But still, she let the book lie in her lap. It felt heavy, too heavy to lift. She was at a crossroads, but the kind that had no signs at it. She wondered what could possibly be inside the book that people should have died for it. She was assuming that Lionel had done away with Pushkar, too. She wondered if later on she would wish she hadn't looked. That was one thing about books. Once you read them, they couldn't be unread. But she could feel Quentin practically panting with excitement at her elbow. What a dork. Always the eager beaver. Suddenly a wave of physical and emotional exhaustion just steamrolled over her, and Plum did want to be reading something, anything at all, rather than sitting in this empty train station lobby, staring at the cinder block walls. She was too tired to feel anything more. She wanted a book to do to her what books did. Take away the world, slide it aside for a little bit, and let her please just be somewhere and somebody else. She was ready to sink, really sink, to the black, airless bottom of where this all began. Okay, she said. Bottoms up. Skull. That made her wish she had a real drink instead of this shitty coffee. She opened the book. From the first page, it was evident that great-grandpa Rupert had had literary aspirations, and that he'd undertaken this project with some actual seriousness of purpose, because he'd arranged the page like a formal title page. He wrote with a fountain pen. The blue ink faded now from midnight blue to midday, but still elegant, a diligent schoolboy's handwriting. The pages weren't ruled for prose. They were set up for columns of numbers, but Rupert had filled them with letters instead. Plum's heart went out to the guy. Probably he was having a midlife crisis, and this was the novel or memoir or whatever that he just had to get out of him. This was how he was going to make his mark, have his say, show the world he wasn't like the others. But if that was true, why lock it in the case? With great ceremony and the deliberate hand of a man who genuinely believed he was making a new beginning for himself, a clean breast of things, Rupert had written and then crossed out 2 possible titles. The Friends of Fillory crossed out, and then Of Clocks and Kings crossed out, before he settled for good and all on The Door in the Page, My Life in 2 Worlds, by Rupert Chatwin. Good call, Quentin said. I think he nailed it. 3rd time's the charm. She turned the page. The next one began. We all thought Martin would get into trouble one day, and in the end, he did. It just wasn't the sort of trouble we were expecting. Evidently, Rupert was happy with that first line, but then not with what came next, because the rest of the page was ripped out, leaving the sentences alone on their own orphan strip of paper. A single accusing finger. The next page was gone too. In fact, there was a thick chunk of stubs where somebody, presumably Rupert, had ripped out 4 or 5 pages at once. Plum realized she wasn't as eager to go on as she thought she would be. She'd kind of forgotten that her great-grandfather was a real person, and his brothers and sisters, too. They'd lived real lives. They'd had real hopes and dreams and secrets, and none of it had worked out the way they wanted it to. They'd felt like the heroes of their own stories, just like she felt like the hero of hers. But that was no guarantee that everything would work out, or anything. After that false start, Rupert wrote quickly, fluidly, with minimal punctuation and only occasional corrections. Plum got the impression he'd never even reread it after he started writing. It was at one of Aunt Maud's parties that it happened for the first time. She often entertained in those days in a lavish style that some people thought was not entirely in line with the sacrifices that we all, as loyal subjects of the king, were expected to make on behalf of the war effort. I suppose hers was a glamorous life, but it never seemed so to us. We all know what it is to be a child, to be innocent, to understand nothing. We understood nothing, the five of us, not anything. But we watched everything. We watched the hired musicians fuss with their instruments, rosin their bows, and empty their spit valves into wine glasses. We watched the ladies wince at their uncomfortable shoes and the men tug at their uncomfortable collars. We saw the faces of the servants assume a practiced blankness the moment before they entered a crowded room. We stole canopies off the trays and loose change from the coats of the guests. But talk of the war bored us, and flirtatious chatter bored us just as much, and none of the guests cared about anything else. The scene may or may not have been glittering, as such parties are always described, but either way it was wasted on us. The only ones who paid any attention to us were the interchangeable young men who passed through the house in an endless parade, and they did so only to try to gain favor with Aunt Maud. Their efforts were misguided. An interest in children was not a quality Aunt Maud prized. In her eyes, it only made them weak and sentimental. An hour or so after the first guests arrived, the dancing would begin. An aunt would drape her long limbs and eventually her entire upper body across the back of the piano to either the consternation or the delight of the pianist, depending on who was playing. Our various bedtimes would come and go, but nobody put us to bed. Eventually, we Chatwin children would retreat, yawning and fractious, to the back halls and upper stories of Dockery House, as it was known, though Aunt Maud didn't like the name. She thought it sounded fussy and Victorian, which it did, which is precisely why we children liked it. It was on one such occasion that Martin began playing with an old grandfather clock that he found standing by itself in a back hallway. He was mechanically minded and could never resist a chance to tinker with something complicated and valuable. As the other boy in the family, I suppose I might have been expected to share his enthusiasm, but I did not. I wasn't one of those keen children with well-defined, clearly articulated interests. I had very few enthusiasms at all apart from books. I was no good at games or music or drawing or figures. I don't wonder that Martin, as I later found out, thought I was weak, like those young men who were always wooing Aunt Maud. But it was in the nature of the calamity that followed that it took the strong and spared the weak. I remember Fiona telling Martin to stop. He would break it, and Helen defending him. Helen never tired of scolding the rest of her siblings, but she worshipped Martin, and he could do no wrong in her eyes. I didn't think it mattered either way, as Maud rarely visited this part of the house. If the clock stopped running, it would be years before she discovered it, at which point she would decide that it had been that way all along. She was a careless woman. Jane said nothing. She rarely spoke unless someone questioned her directly, and sometimes not even then. Once he had the cabinet open, Martin began repeating, "Bloody hell," under his breath. Even Helen shushed him when he swore. When he had been doing a great deal ever since our father went to... Which he had been doing a great deal ever since our father went to France. The year was 1915. If I haven't mentioned it, and father was a lieutenant in the artists' rifles, A regiment that, its whimsical designation notwithstanding, was about to embark on a tour of the most brutal battlefields the Great War had to offer. I had wandered a little way down the hall to examine an interesting spider web in an angle of the ceiling, but upon hearing Martin, I came back. I believe I was hoping that he and Helen might have a row. The clock was a monster, its flat brass dial so richly studded with circles and hands and curious symbols that it looked like a cross, scowly face. Martin dragged over a stool, the better to study it eye to eye, as it were. Cool, damp air breathed from inside its cabinet, as it would from the mouth of a cave. As we watched the clock whirled to life and chimed the hour, 9 o'clock at night. Little Jane yawned. Martin stared at the clock furiously, meeting its crooked gaze, mussing his own hair without noticing it, as he did when something vexed him. He hopped down. "Bloody hell," he said. "Roops, take a look inside. What do you see?" I obediently bent my head to look into the cabinet, and Martin pinned my arms and attempted to shove me inside. It was his idea of a joke. He was always shouldering me into closets and downstairs. There was nothing sinister in it. We were just bored to sobs. "Leave off, Martin," Fiona said, but without much conviction. We tussled. The clock wobbled dangerously. He was stronger, but leverage was on my side, and eventually I got my shoulders jammed in the opening in such a way as to make further progress impossible. I sometimes wonder if things would have been different had he succeeded. But as it was, he saw there was no more fun to be had, and he let me up. I was red-faced and breathing hard. My collar popped up on one side. He swaggered away in a circle to show that he hadn't really meant it. "Really? Have a look," he said. "There's no works inside. No pendulum. What makes it go?" No one was much intrigued by this mystery. Jane picked at a bit of peeling wallpaper. Fiona leaned against a wall and rolled her eyes at boys. "All right," he said. "I'll get in myself." Martin was determined to get some comic material out of this empty clock, one way or the other. As the eldest, I think he felt responsible for entertaining us. He began stuffing himself into the clock's wooden body. I don't think he expected to succeed. His shoulders were filling out even then, and I remember his curious frown when he reached an arm in and couldn't find the back. He ducked whole upper body inside. It looked like stage magic, one of Houdini's trapdoor boxes. I saw him hesitate, but only for a moment. He put one foot in, then the other, then he was gone. We all looked at each other. Fiona, irritated at the idea that a trick was being played on her, put her head in next. Only seven and small for her age. She barely had to duck. She disappeared inside too. Helen and I stared. "Jane," I called, for she was still busy fooling with the wallpaper. It seems impossible to me now, but she can only have been 5 years old. "Jane." She came trotting over, and curious. "Where's Fi?" she said. It was a lengthy soliloquy by her standards. At that moment, first Martin and then Fiona came spilling back out of the clock, Martin spitting mad, Fiona in something like a blissful daze. The first thing I noticed, even before their clothes, was that they both looked suntanned and fit, and their hair had grown by an inch. They smelled like fresh grass. Time runs differently in Fillory. To them, a month had passed. Just like that, Martin and Fiona had had their first adventure there, which Christopher Plover would later write about in The World in the Walls. That was the beginning of everything for us, the Chatwin children, and it was the end of everything for us too. That's it for chapter 16. We will see you guys next week with chapter 17.